Okay, so we're delighted to have Nancy Snow, Jen Cole-Wright, and Michael Warren join us. They are the co-authors of a new book that's just out that's really fantastic, Understanding Virtue, Theory and Measurement. They'll be talking about that among other things today. They'll have about an hour to present it, and Jen is going to do the presenting. Then we'll have our standard 25 or 30-minute breakout rooms that one of them will lead each one of them. And then we'll come back together to have more discussion as a whole group after that. So Jen Cole-Wright is a professor of psychology at the College of Charleston, and she studies moral development and moral psychology generally. She's interested in how moral values and norms develop over time and influence people's reactions to divergent beliefs, practices in pluralistic societies. She's particularly interested in the social liberal versus conservative mindsets on those reactions. So she's going to fix American society for us, and that'll be great. So she's published in a lot of prominent journals, and this recent book is with the Oxford University Press, which is a fabulous press. So congratulations on that. And we're delighted to have you and looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Jen. So I will now turn the time over to you.
Great, I appreciate that. And I got rock, paper, scissored into giving the presentation. And I apologize for some of you. I recognize a few faces that were at the Nancy's luncheon. And so some of this is going to be repeat, though hopefully we'll get further into the slides than we did last time. Let me go ahead and share the slides and make sure I can get everything set up. Can everybody see? Everyone see the slides okay?
I don't see them yet.
Oh, okay. That's because I'm not sharing it. I'm just, okay, here, let's try. Let's do that again. Let's start by first sharing the screen. Okay, now you can see the screen, right? Can everybody see okay? Yep, thumbs up, good. Okay, so this is, I think I've got everything to where I can see you all and the slides at the same time. All right, so we already just had a shameless plug for the book, but you know, what the heck, here's another one. You know, the reflection on how to develop an account of virtue that is both, you know, we've got two psychologists and a philosopher coming together to try to talk about this across disciplines and think about how to create an account that is true to both disciplines. And this was a labor of love and a lot of pain. I was just going back and looking through some of the notes, and I think we started on this project back in like 2013, so it's been a long time coming. But we might be interested in this question, and I'm sure no one in this room is really too bothered by this question, but why should we care about virtue? But for me as a psychologist, this is a particularly important question because in my area, there are a lot of people interested in, you know, behaving well in, you know, moral intuitions and pro-social behavior and lots of different constructs, but there's not nearly the amount of discussion of virtue as there should be. These underlying capacities when we're faced with difficult situations. I mean, we're not just interested in when people do well or do the right thing, but when they do, they have a disposition to do the right thing for the, you know, in the right circumstances, under the, even when it's difficult, and for the right reasons. And in addition to being an academic, I'm an activist that I do a lot of work in both racial justice and healing, and also in climate. And this is an area where that would benefit tremendously from more discussion about virtue and about being able to dispositionally understand what's called for in different situations and respond accordingly. And certainly, you know, the world is filled with circumstances under which, you know, things happen, tragedies happen. We've been inundated with news recently of lots of different bombings and conflicts that are happening around the world. And when we think about what it is that we need to be able to address this sort of violence in the world, I mean, certainly compassion is one of those concepts that comes up a lot, but our dispositional capacity to stand up to things that we see happening in our community, being able to say no and being able to challenge the status quo, being able to speak truth to power, being able to be generous with our time and with our thoughts and with our money, being able to express kindness and compassion to people who are struggling and suffering, and being able to have a unified, integrated response to the challenges that we face in the world, having that develop as a sort of underlying character to being able to see what's going on and respond to the world appropriately. I mean, this is something that seems really critical and increasingly critical to me, that we have to understand how these virtues develop, how we facilitate them, and how in a world that often doesn't necessarily, makes these sorts of things somewhat difficult, if not incredibly difficult to express, how we learn to be able to express them anyways. So the challenges that we tried to tackle in this book, obviously this book is not going to address this larger question that I'm talking about, but what it's doing is just thinking through how do we develop an account of virtue that's philosophically robust, that would be the sort of thing that philosophers would respect, but at the same time is psychologically realistic, and works for human beings such as we are functioning in the world. And then how would we measure that? What are some of the strategies that we could use to determine whether or not these particular types of traits, these virtues that we've defined, are actually present in the circumstances under which they're present? We also then went on to talk about what it would mean for these to become integrated within a character, within one's overall personality, such that we could talk about them as having good character. They have a series of different virtues that work together and inform one another and influence one another. And then how would we measure that? And my guess is that we're not going to have a lot of time to get into challenge 3 and 4, but we're going to work our way through the first 2 challenges together. Okay, so assuming this, basic definition of virtue as being an underlying disposition to do the right thing, in the right way and at the right time. So being attuned to and sensitive to the contingencies of the situation that you're in, such that the response that you give is appropriate to the situation that you're in and for the right reasons. There's a lot here that has to be unpacked. First, we have to have the capacity to be able to respond, to engage in particular behaviors in response to the external situations that we're in, even and especially when it is hard to do so. There has to be a lot of unpacking of the underlying perceptual, cognitive, affective mechanisms, the underlying cognition and affective experiences that help us to not only ascertain that this is a situation in which a particular virtue is called for, but that that the response, what it would mean to be courageous in this situation, or what it would mean to be generous in this situation, is to act in the following way. And obviously that's going to vary. What's the courageous thing to do in a difficult family conversation is going to look very different than what it is to be courageous in a situation where there's conflict happening in front of you in public or something like that. So just because we are developing this virtue of courage doesn't mean that automatically leads to behavioral responses. We have to understand how it is that we attune to and respond appropriately. And what are the underlying motivational features that allow us to do that allow us to see the situation, understand that certain virtues are called for, and feel motivated to respond accordingly, even when it may be challenging and difficult for us to do so. And of course, of particular interest to us for a variety of reasons is the degree to which that can stabilize into some sort of global disposition where we are able to respond accordingly. We're able to respond with the particular virtue across a wide range of situations and over an extended period of time. So it's something that's not just transient. It doesn't happen occasionally. I mean, just like a broken clock is right twice a day, we may stumble upon being compassionate or being honest in particular situations. But what we're interested in here is the degree to which that becomes something that is a stable and reliable response to the world across the range of different situations and situationally different types of circumstances. So when Nancy and I were first starting to sit down, this is before Michael came on board, and we were kind of thinking through what it would mean to develop a psychologically robust account. We went to the area in psychological science that made the most sense, which is the personality science, as a source of theoretical material to use to think about what would it mean for for virtues to function as these underlying, reliable dispositions. Like, what would it mean to have something like a trait that could manifest across a wide range of different situations? And of course, personality science is where a lot of good work is being done with relation to mostly non-virtue sorts of traits. But there's a little bit of here. There's a lot of discussion about the fact that people's behavior and the degree to which we can attribute, and of course, a lot of the people who are working directly in this area, you're all here and you understand this far better than I do, but the degree to which we are, we behave in ways that are not necessarily trait consistent. So, I may be honest in one situation and not honest in a variety of other situations. I might act in an extroverted fashion in one situation, but then act in a much more introverted fashion in other situations. And so there's a high degree of within person variability in our expression of any particular trait over time, which makes it doesn't seem very trait-like. And yet at the same time, it's still the case that we can say of particular people that they are more extroverted than others. So even though there is a high degree of within person variability, there's, across time, we can see reliable patterns of trait dispositions or trait responses, trait expression showing up over time. And so one of the theories at the time that was really, we felt doing a wonderful job, not to inflate the floating head that's with us right now. But one of the theories that we thought was doing a really good job of capturing both the within subject variability, right, or within person variability, the being able to explain why any given expression of a trait is only mildly related to any other expression. So with the degree to which someone is honest in any one situation may only be mildly related to the other forms of honesty that they're expressing or other circumstances under which they're expressing honesty. And yet people display these broad tendencies to manifest a particular trait stably across situation independent behavior. Like, so if we average across all the different variability, we see these stable and situation independent behavioral averages emerging that stand as stable individual differences. So even though the degree to which I might express honesty varies quite a bit across situations, it might turn out that I am nonetheless more inclined to being honest overall than someone else, for example. So we have this a wedding of both the social cognitive sensitivity to situational variability and flexibility, but also it still captures our desire to have some sort of predictive power that something like a trait would give us, to be able to say that there are these stable individual differences. And whole trait theory does that in part by providing the descriptive side of the trait, so being able to understand and map out the distribution of trait expression across a wide range of situations over time, right? So measuring and documenting how often and to what degree people express different traits, but then also being able to provide a theory of the mechanisms underlying that explain that distribution, that explain why the variability in trait expression exists in the way that it does. So we took that basic structure and began trying to develop a virtue-specific version of what that might look like in terms of people's ability to express virtues across a wide range of situations over time. So we have, I'm going to break this down into 3 different sections that then we can unpack a little bit further, and those map onto the empirical side of the discussion, which is like how would we end up measuring these if we're interested in trying to track these in people across real life situations. How would we measure them? And the first is what we call what were called the inputs, the internal and external trait relevant stimuli. So the features of our environment that are relevant to the expression of a particular trait. There are reasons for a trait potentially being expressed, all things considered. In the presence of these stimuli, which of course requires us to both see them and identify them as such, which we'll talk about more in a moment, triggers a cascade of intermediary responses where we have underlying cognitive, affective, and motivational states that are being activated and are working together to interpret the stimuli and assess the larger situation and assess, our own relationship to those stimuli and ultimately generate a trait appropriate response, which obviously is most easily measurable in terms of the actual behavior that we engage in, but also is going to involve a variety of different mental states itself. I mean, there is, a trait appropriate affective response to suffering. There is a trait appropriate set of beliefs and values that become activated in response to something that we're seeing in the world. Okay. So let's think for a minute about the trait relevant stimuli. What do we mean by that? The first thing, of course, and this is where some of the measurement stuff gets tricky, which we'll talk about later. But the first thing is the fact that there are objective features of the situations that we encounter that call for a particular type of response, right? So if we see someone who's being, abused in some way, verbally or physically abused by someone, that calls for a particular type of response. Or if we, there's someone in need and we have the time and the finances to be able to help. I mean, there's that calls for a trait appropriate response that we can either respond to or fail to respond to. And of course, there could be other features of the environment that override the fact that this trait appropriate response is called for, but nonetheless, that it's there. But it becomes additionally complicated by the fact that as human beings, we have to, in addition to the objective features of the environment, there's going to be our subjective interpretation of those features, the degree to which we see them as trait relevant. So one of the things that's going to be really important when it comes to the development of virtue is helping to increase people's sensitivity to awareness of, recognition of various features of their environment as being trait appropriate. Right, so we see them as calling for compassion or calling for honesty or calling for courage, and that is felt as a reason to engage in a trait appropriate response, even though we may not be consciously aware of the fact that we are seeing it as such. We don't have to be consciously thinking about the fact that, compassion is called for in this situation, but we feel ourselves pulled upon to express compassion in a given situation. And it's important also to recognize that a further complication is that the stimuli that we may be responding to are often in the external world, but they can also be internal. So there are a variety of beliefs. I mean, it's interesting if you think about the literature on how we explicitly begin to interfere with implicit racism. We may be socially programmed to have racist beliefs or responses, towards particular people, and then begin to actively try to override those. That might be an example of something where there's an internal stimuli that we are aware of and we're called upon to respond in a particular way. In this case, to try to actively bring it into question and override it. So both of these environments are important when we're thinking about the expression of virtue. The other thing that's really important is that even though people are often merely responding to trait relevant stimuli, right? Our environments are filled with trait relevant stimuli, and that we can respond to or fail to respond to. But we also have the agency to take control of our environment and alter it in a variety of trait appropriate ways, like this little guy picking up the leaf to cover his head. So when it comes to the development of virtue, the expression of virtue, a really important consideration is the degree to which we take steps to make it easier, perhaps, or at least more likely that we will express certain virtues, to make the virtue expression more socially valued and approved of. We find ways to avoid certain situations that would, like if I'm someone who cares about honesty, I find ways to avoid situations in which dishonesty would be tempting, or I tend to avoid dishonest people. So I'm finding ways to make my environment more honest, more to allow the flourishing of honesty more likely to happen. Right. And of course, this is going to matter across all the different virtues that we're trying to develop, but we're finding ways to make that possible. And so we're not, even though we're possessors of traits, we're not necessarily simply passive reactors, but also active constructors of both our internal and external environments. Right now, I'm doing a CBCT training. It's out of Emory University. It's a cognitively based compassion training. And there's a lot of meditation involved. But that's part of the goal of this particular training is to powerfully change the internal environments, to make compassion a much more natural and much more sustainable response, because you've done the internal work to allow compassion to be a natural place that you go, no matter how difficult the circumstances are. It's easy to get to a place where compassion can be generated and experienced and maintained. So there's active work being done on internal environments to change our capacity for compassion. So these are really important things to be thinking about. And so that's all just like in terms of the degree to which we are responding to and creating the environment within which we can respond to the stimuli that are in our environments, the features of our world that call upon us to respond virtuously. But then we have to also think about these intermediary processes. And obviously, all of this is there's tons of deep feedback loops. These, we're drawing distinctions that are probably psychologically quite messy. But what are we thinking about when we're thinking about social cognitive mechanisms? Well, we're thinking about the fact that as we are developing virtues, and really as we're developing any personality trait, these are not happening within a vacuum, but they're happening within, they're being either helped or hindered, they're being influenced, their expression, their structure is being deeply influenced by the underlying personality structures that are already there, the underlying cognitive and affective mechanisms, motivational mechanisms that are already in place that started from quite young. So things like, our underlying temperament, our physiological dispositions. Are we someone who responds very strongly to negative stimuli, or are we much more calm physiologically? That's going to matter when it comes to developing the capacity for things like courage or honesty. I mean, honesty may be much more difficult to express when the potential negative outcome of telling someone the truth really activates you dispositionally, creates a lot of anxiety and a lot of underlying, like it's a very aversive, just imagining what's going to happen when you tell someone the truth creates a very aversive environment. And the degree to which you might be introverted or extroverted or a variety of other things are going to then have an influence on not only what virtues are going to be, how virtues develop, which ones are easier to develop, but the form that they take. what do we believe about ourselves, about others, the different schema that we're working with, our different understandings of things, how someone gets on the bus and they're struggling with their bags. This is an example I used last time, right? They're struggling with their bags, that they're obviously heavy, they need a place to sit, they need some help. But what beliefs are generated when I look at them as being someone worthy of being helped or not being helped? I mean, how do my underlying attitudes about my responsibilities, about my role in all of this, how does that facilitate me being able to express compassion, being able to respond in a helpful manner or not? What kinds of behavioral patterns have I already developed? What sorts of, from a very young age, we're learning certain behavioral scripts. We're learning certain habitual patterns of ways to respond to stimuli that we see in the environment. And that could either help or hinder the development of virtue. Certain things are just natural and easy for us to do. And certain things are going to take a lot of effort to be able to, because we have to push ourselves to do things that are very much outside of our comfort zone. And I think probably at the center of this, when it comes to virtue, I mean, motivations obviously play an interesting role in non-virtue traits as well. But when it comes to virtues, arguably the motivational structures are really at the center when it comes to understanding how the desires, the values, the goals, the commitments, the longer term kind of motivational structures, the immediate motivational structures of what do I desire to do in this moment, and the longer term motivational structures like goals and commitments that we might have, values that are very important to us, that then orient us towards responding in a virtuous way. We respond because it's the honest thing to do, or because it's what's required of us in this particular moment, as opposed to other reasons why we might act in that way. At the core, as I just mentioned, at the core of all personality traits are these motivational states, right? So if I'm shy, right, then I might desire to avoid social embarrassment, and I might value my privacy. I might value being able to maintain my privacy and not have the awkwardness of people interfering with my life. I might have a goal of protecting myself from the awkward situations that I've encountered in the past, where I've engaged in social environments with people and it's been really uncomfortable. And so I have motivational structures that are going to make me more inclined to respond to shy, relevant stimuli. Someone's approaching me, someone's asking intrusive personal questions, I'm being asked to respond in a public setting. I'm going to be inclined to give shy, appropriate responses, precisely in part because of these underlying motivational desires that make the shy, appropriate response seem like the right one to have. I think one of the most important differences then between personality traits and virtues is that, and this is certainly not going to be true how do I want to say this? It's not the case that traits, other non-virtue traits, couldn't have trait-oriented values, right? Or motivational states. I might desire to be more extroverted, and so orient myself towards developing that trait. But virtues necessarily have motivational traits that have desires, values, commitments, other motivational structures that are not just trait relevant, but they're also trait oriented, right? So they're directed at the development of the trait itself, right? So we desire to be more honest, more compassionate, and therefore are taking the various steps that we're taking to instantiate those traits, like doing the CBC2 training in order to be able to be more reliably compassionate in difficult situations in the world. And the in this motivational structure is the identification of virtue development as a goal worth striving for. Like, it's worth trying to do the work to be more honest. It's worth doing the work to be more compassionate or more generous. These are traits that are of value to develop, because a world in which there's more honesty and more compassion is a better world. I think that that one of the reasons, or one of the interesting things that comes out of these kinds of trait motivational states, and this gets back to the whole discussion of whether, whether virtues can be stable dispositions or not, and all of that whole debate, is that trait-oriented motivational states do a number of things. One, they provide a context general motivation, right, that can be activated across a wide range of situations. Right. So if honesty is the best policy, if I think that being compassionate is something that's just important to be, or being generous is something that is consistently of value, and that's regardless of the situation that I'm in, then it provides a kind of umbrella motivation, a motivation that stretches across a wide range of situational variability to stabilize not only my sensitivity to trait relevant stimuli, sensitivity to circumstances under which honesty is called for, but it stabilizes my motivation to respond appropriately. So it makes it easier for me to be honest in situations where I might otherwise be inclined to not be. So it provides a sort of stability that we're looking for when we're talking about robust virtues. And it also links them in important ways to our identity, right? So there's ways in which we begin to see ourselves as the sort of people for which virtue is a critical part of our personality economy. We want, if I have a goal of being a good parent or being a good teacher, if part of my story is that I'm someone who fights for equity or justice, or wants to heal damage that's been done in one way or the other, or just, fight to make the world a better place in some way, then that is an identity attribute that makes certain virtues, it makes it meaningful to do the work to express the virtues. It makes it the alternative less tempting, and the necessity of virtue seems kind of emerges as a pretty clear thing. It's like, if I want to be a good parent, then that means I'm going to have to learn to be patient. I'm going to have to exercise patience even when it's difficult to do so. I'm going to have to, be, loving and honest in circumstances where I may be disinclined to do so, because that's what it means to be a good parent. So it helps to provide the cross-situational stability that is necessary for the robust traits, or what you might call global traits, to emerge. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff to be done from an empirical standpoint here in this motivational arena. I love this picture. So something else that's worth thinking about is the fact that these states can be self-indexed, but not self-oriented in the way where we might worry about them being egoistic. And this has come up in a couple different places, this discussion. I recently was giving a talk on humility, and of course, humility is one of those places where the desire to be humble feels almost counterproductive to humility, or something along those lines. It has a paradoxical component to it. And we were discussing this issue of, can you be motivated to develop or instantiate a virtue, and to be a virtuous agent without that being something that is, oddly oriented toward yourself in a way that might be problematic for a virtue, especially for a virtue like humility. And we can say that these states are self-indexed, right? So we are motivated to be the sort of person that instantiates these virtues without them being egoistic in the way that we might worry about, right? So it's about being the sort of person that would develop these sorts of virtues, because these virtues are important. Not necessarily because it's important for me to be virtuous, but because it's important for these virtues to be instantiated just across the board, regardless of who it is that's instantiating them. Something else that's been very much a part of this discussion, I think more on the philosophical side than the psychological side, is the worry that we don't want to over-intellectualize. Right? So we want to be able to talk about these motivational states as being motivating without them necessarily needing to be conscious. So they need not be a current right, at the time that the response, or even consciously accessible, right? So we can value or otherwise desire to bring about X without explicitly having formed the value or the goals to do it, right? And so this represents, not only is this important from a theoretical standpoint, but it represents a unique sort of empirical challenge. How do we get at the underlying motivational states that people might have? I mean, not only do we have to worry about the post hoc problem of people generating reasons that actually weren't the reasons that they're using at the time, but what would it mean for someone to be motivated or moved by a particular reason to do something? And so one of the arguments that we give is that what we need, it's less about what was in fact actually motivating them in the moment, right? Even though it's important to try to figure out what that is, but it's about upon being presented with a particular motivational state, being moved by it, recognizing it as the sort of thing that might move you to act. It's something that actually you find motivating, whether it was something that was actually on your mind at the time you were acting or not. So here's an example, right? Imagine an honest person who gives truthful information to someone who asks for it. And I think this is an example that Christian Miller and I were talking about, right? So if asked why she did it, she might simply say something like, well, he asked me a question, right? She needed the information. So there's not any sort of meaningful underlying motivation that we would consider to be honest, relevant here. It's like, well, he asked me a question, so I answered it. But it seems reasonable to assume that if we encouraged her to say more, that she might, if pushed, she might eventually say things like, well, it's just generally a good idea to give people accurate information when they ask for it. It'd be wrong for me to lie, unless I had a good reason to do so. It's like if we were to ask her to consider whether she would have given him the wrong information, so we could push her to kind of consider the situation a little bit more deeply. It's important to be honest in our dealings with others, right? So we're gonna end up in a place where we've got these more general motivational states that are there. And even if she didn't herself generate these, it seems reasonable to think that she would endorse them. If we were to say, well, do you agree with the fact that it's important to be honest in our dealings with others? Generally speaking, she would probably say, yeah, I agree with that. It is something that, if I were to think about it, is actually motivating. So those motivational states are there and are motivating, even if in the moment when we're acting, we're simply responding because someone came up and asked us information. So we responded. But, thinking about what the circumstances under which we would have done otherwise, we realized that, well, of course I gave him the right information, because it would be weird for me to do otherwise. It would be inconsistent with the sort of person I take myself to be to do otherwise, because generally speaking, it's a good idea to be honest. So thinking creatively about how to get at these underlying motivational states is an important empirical piece. So when it gets to the trait appropriate responses, I mean, we've done a lot of the unpacking at this point of, we've got these trait relevant stimuli, we've got features of the world that we are seeing, we are responding to, we're interpreting them as being trait relevant. This is honesty is called for in this situation, or compassion is called for. It triggers a whole range of cognitive and affective states and motivational states that then leads to, hopefully, more often than not, us actually being responding in a way that's trait appropriate. And these trait appropriateness runs deep, right? It's not just the observable behavior of actually giving the right information, but the whole cascade of underlying cognitive, affective, and motivational structures that give rise to the giving of the proper information, or the giving up of your seat so the woman can sit down on the bus, or whatever it is that you're doing, that orient you to the situation in the right sort of way to have given the right sort of response for the right reasons. And then how do we know whether that's become something that we can actually say, at what point it's kind of like, at what point are you bald? How many hairs do you have to be missing before you're bald? Or how many specks of sand count as a heap? When do you get to count as an honest person? And I know there's some disagreement about whether this is a spectrum or whether it's scalar. We say yes or no. But it's like, at what point in time do we say that someone possesses a trait of honesty or compassion or generosity or whatever? And using the dispositional density idea, we can track the degree to which people give a trait appropriate response across a range of different types of situations under which the appropriate response is called for. So there's a couple of different things that we need to be thinking about here. One is the types of situations under which the response is given and the consistency with which those types of situations produce them. So we can unpack that in two ways. One, we can think of it, consistency as being the frequency with which a person has a virtue appropriate response to virtue relevant stimuli, and it can be measured across two different dimensions. And this gets back into some really important stuff, which has to do with the degree to which the person, him or herself who's responding, sees the situations as being similar. Right, so that's a really interesting thing to unpack. It's like, to what degree do we view these as being similar kinds of situations within which a particular response is called for, as opposed to completely different situations? So as a researcher, we might think these are similar enough to warrant the same response, but the person, him or herself, may not. But we have both the depth, the frequency with which people respond appropriately to the same or similar virtue relevant stimuli. So you're presented with the same sorts of features of the environment, which if you are interpreting is the same or similar and responding appropriately, and the range of different types of stimuli to which you respond appropriately, right? It might be that you're pretty consistently honest when your best friend asks you a question, but maybe not so honest when it's your parents asking you the question. And what is it about those two differences that make them saliently different, such that the honest response is quite easy to give in one situation and not easy to give in the other? And how might that change if you have these sort of trait-oriented motivational states that we talked about earlier, to where honesty is important, regardless of whether it's your best friend or your parents that are asking the questions? You guys could let my kids know that would be good. And then there's also the issue of habituality, right? So the extent to which these responses become automatic, but dynamically so. So we're not talking about rote responses. We're talking about responses that we don't have to think about, they just happen, but they are nonetheless appropriately responsive to the contingencies of the environment. So they're sensitive to the ways in which the features may be different, the subtleties of the situation that we're in, and they adapt accordingly to what could be potentially rapidly changing stimuli. So I often think of, it's very easy to think of physical skills, like, being a really good skier or something, where the better you are, the more automatic the behavioral adaptations are to the contingencies of the snow, what kind of snow you're skiing on, how steep the hill is and things like that, but it's happening very automatically and very rapidly. And the more habituality and the more consistency, we might say, the deeper the density. I don't know, what does it mean? More dense, the more dispositionally dense the trait is. Okay, so taking a deep breath for a moment. I don't know, how am I doing on time? I have not been paying attention. Okay.
It looks like you have about 15 minutes or so, at least.
Oh, good heavens. Okay, so, all right. So I want to talk really quickly about practical wisdom, because that's something that matters when it comes to having a philosophically robust account of virtue. I don't think you're going to be able to get away from addressing the issue of practical wisdom. And so we think of practical wisdom or phronesis. There's, Russell identifies a variety of different related and intertwined capacities, but in the book we address it from we address it in terms of its functions, which happen both at the virtue level, so our capacity to regulate situation-specific virtues. So again, if we're trying to figure out where we locate practical wisdom, what we're saying is that our ability to adaptively respond to situations can be found in this space here of our sensitivity to the stimuli and our underlying cognitive, affective, and motivational responses to it. And that happens both at the level of the virtue, regulating situation-specific virtue expression, but then also at the character level, coordinating the expression of multiple virtues together, and then also guiding the whole package according to a conception of like a blueprint or a conception of the good life that orients us and what it is that we're doing in a sort of coherent fashion. And then there's also the degree to which practical wisdom provides emotional regulation, but we see that as being packaged back into the social cognitive mechanisms, both at the virtue level and the character level. So we might think of practical wisdom as being the synchronization of interrelated perceptual, cognitive, affective, and motivational capacities that link everything together so that the present of trait relevant stimuli is perceived and responded to in a trait appropriate manner that is both aligned with and consistent with the person's trait relevant and oriented motivational states and their narrative identity, their features of their identity that are both trait relevant and trait oriented. And then it responds, that's supposed to say it responds responsive to or adaptive to changes in the trait relevant stimuli, both within and between situations. Okay. So what we're talking about here is then the ability to harmonize the unique constellation of virtues that a person has and develops over the course of living a life in which they encounter a range of different circumstances and situations that make certain virtues really stand out as salient, maybe others not as salient in their own individual expression of a life well lived. So practical wisdom serves as a sort of checks and balances of the individual virtues within the psychological economy of the virtuous person who has a whole range of other non-virtue related stuff going on. Okay, so what I want to do in the 10 minutes that we have left is just highlight some of the features of measurement hopefully that can be more of our discussion as we go into breakout rooms and then come back and talk as a whole. So there's one of the things that hopefully is pretty clear at this point and not at all surprising is that what we're talking about is a pretty complex range of things that a virtue measurement program or program interested in tracking the development and expression of virtues, there's a lot here to unpack, right? So maybe this is done independently in different people's labs and they focus on different components, or maybe someone tries to package it all together in some sort of way, but there's a lot here that we need to pay attention to. One is the degree to which we understand what kind of stimuli call for trait appropriate responses. So if we think, for example, of honesty, right, being able to track the degree to which people both perceive certain features of their environment as being honesty relevant and are then able to or not able to respond to them as honesty relevant, right? So you could imagine presenting a whole range of different stimuli to people, features of like those story scenarios in which some of them they may track as being highly honesty relevant, others maybe a little bit, maybe some not at all, and that's going to vary across people, the degree to which they see things in their world as being as calling for an honest response, and then the degree to which they are able to then provide the appropriate response to those stimuli. Do they have underlying motivational states? Do they tend to respond to those stimuli in a way that would be considered honest? Are they willing to do so and accept the consequences even if they're unpleasant? And being able to track not only what stimuli people think of as being honesty relevant, but then also the responses that they have to those. And so you could see from a developmental standpoint, both development in both of these areas is going to be important. Can we expand the range of stimuli, features of people's environments that people perceive as being calling for courage, compassion, generosity, what have you? And then can we boost up and expand upon the underlying cognitive, affective, and behavioral responses that they have to those stimuli? Are people able to perceive within a variety of different scenarios the presence of these stimuli and generate their own? If we ask them to imagine circumstances under which honesty would be called for, what do they come up with? What are the range of fictional and actual features, situations that they come up with that would elicit honesty? And do they recognize as appropriate or inappropriate different types of responses to honesty relevant situations? And there's a range of ways in which these could be given, whether they're thinking about themselves or they're responding to something someone else did, whether they're thinking about their past and things that could have been done differently, whether they're thinking about current situations they're in, whether they're being given hypothetical scenarios to imagine how they would respond. There's a range of ways that we could test their capacity for trait appropriate responses to trait relevant stimuli. Another piece of this is obviously the degree to which they have as chronically accessible, easily triggerable values and goals that are oriented towards the traits themselves, the virtues that matter, and identify themselves as being the sort of person who possesses or wishes to possess and exercise those particular virtues. So do they, and of course, there's a difference between explicit expression of goals and values and as opposed to implicit orientation. And there's some interesting stuff that Jeremy Frimmer's done in trying to measure the difference between these. And I'm sure there's other stuff out there. It's like, to what degree do our implicit orientations towards things map up with our explicit expression of what we value? And then also, to what degree do we explicitly express certain features as being important identity attributes of ourselves, our actual versus potentially ideal selves? And then to what degree do our behaviors, our responses show us as being implicitly oriented towards those identity attributes? We may not explicitly express them as being part of who we are, but we nonetheless behave in a way, in such a way as to affirm the fact that it's important to us. Trying to grab in a graphic form the complexity of dispositionality. How do you measure dispositionality or density distribution, right? So measuring it in terms of its consistency, habituality, trying to figure out a way to get at both the depth and the breadth of trait appropriate responses to stimuli. How often do they consistently respond? What's a range of stimuli that they respond consistently with? So going back to what we were just talking about a moment ago, capturing it within this framework of being able to establish the density distribution. And then when it comes to practical wisdom, being able to look at the degree to which people, as you change the stimuli, the features of the environment, to what degree are they responding to changes that are virtue relevant? Like my tendency to want to be compassionate is changing as a function of virtue relevant features changing, but not virtue irrelevant features. So, like for example, the person that gets on the bus is someone who's affluent versus someone who's clearly poor. What we would consider to being completely irrelevant to the expression of the virtue, does that influence me? Or am I relatively insensitive to that? And the degree to which I am adapting my virtue appropriate responses across the situations according to the way in which the situational variables are changing, that's virtue relevant. I think so. We've got we didn't get into the character, as I assumed we wouldn't probably have time, but obviously the other critical thing here is going to be figuring out how people adjudicate between virtues. How do we coordinate an honest but kind response a courageous but compassionate response? How do we deal with conflicts that may arise between virtues? How do virtues infuse and influence one another so that the response that we're having is actually the byproduct of multiple virtues that are working together? And then I just really quickly, I'm going to skip this. I wanted to get to the third function, right? The way in which our virtues are, we harmonize the unique constellation of virtues, because we're not all going to develop the same virtues in the same way, and we're not all going to express them in the same way, even if we have them. And so how do we harmonize that constellation in a way that allows us to organize and orient towards, this life that this vision that we have for a life well lived, this vision of, being a good person? How do we harmonize the virtues that we have in such a way that we maximize those that we are best at, and begin to accommodate the places where we may not be as strong, in a way that allows us to live our lives consistent with that. So as opposed to derailing our lives because there's things that we are particularly good at. We all have our strengths and weaknesses from a personality perspective. How do we balance that in a way that is consistent with living a life that's not only objectively well lived in some way, but is the life that we would want to live? And I think I'll stop there and leave the rest for discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing slides. And happy to send the slides to anyone who might want them, because I know that was a lot of stuff.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jen, for that wonderful talk. And it was superbly organized and clear as a bell. So I really appreciate your efforts and your ability to convey all of that, because you did convey a lot of information. So what we plan to do now is break into 3 groups to have some discussion with the co-authors of the book. And I pretty much randomly assign people to groups. If you would like to switch groups because you're just dying to talk to Jen or Michael or Nancy, you can do so. I'll drop in from time to time. It looks like we have enough time to probably go with, let's say, a 25-minute breakout period. Make sure I've got that set right. And then we'll come back. You'll get a 1-minute warning that you'll be brought back to the main group, but in the meantime, you can converse and to your heart's content. So enjoy the breakout rooms. I'll see you in a little bit.
What a good life looks like, then are you meaning to record?
Is that okay?
Yeah, is what I'm saying so incredibly profound that
Mhm. Yeah,
but it's like, so what if we have all these different like cultural ways of defining, what a good life looks like and what it is that we're trying to do, how are we to unpack that in terms of understanding when something is virtually virtuous or appropriate or not. So one example was that we ended on, we were in the middle of trying to unpack is female genital mutilation, and like the harm of taking away someone's ability to belong to a culture by engaging in that practice, weighed against the harm of the practice itself, which we might say from outside that culture, we might have clear reasons for why that's an unnecessary and harmful practice. And like, how do you balance that? How do you balance between what we might say is an overarching objective conception of the good life that's grounded in some facts about human beings and as the creatures that they are, and our best case cultural interpretations of that, which are very different from across time and across geographical location.
yeah, that's certainly a big question for us, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's begin our discussion as a group. So what questions or comments do you have for our panelists at this point? Feel free to raise your hand physically or electronically. Go ahead, Barry.
So this has to do with this notion of quantification that came up in the discussion group that I was not in. It seems to me that if you have some notion that of what might be called the priority of the particular in thinking about virtue, then that seems to me to be antithetical to scientifically aggregating and classifying. If we really mean all situations are unique and call for situationally appropriate responses, then the collapsing into categories violates that. And you can't do psychology without doing some of that violating and collapsing. So the question is, what's the coherence of a project, the success of which seems to violate the most fundamental aspect of what it is we're trying to make sense of?
Panelists?
Does anyone want to take that? So it's interesting because my ABA, the behaviorists in my department would disagree that the measuring of the specific is inconsistent with psychology and with science, because they do it all the time. They don't generalize across, like when they're measuring, rat responses to particular stimuli, what you're seeing are changes in time in particular rats. They don't really congregate across them so much. And I also think that we would do well to reinvigorate the value of the case study, right? That there's something to be said for studying fewer individuals in a much deeper, richer, more complicated across time scenarios. But I don't think that means that we're not going to be able to locate generalizable mechanisms, generalizable features, right? I mean, things that people typically respond compassionately to, things that people, what a compassionate response typically looks like. I don't think we're confused by, I think we would be able to say, for example, if I asked you to, at least at some level, what do we mean by honesty? There's going to be some basics that we can identify as being indicative of honesty or indicative of a generous response, that sort of thing. Will?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and sort of what we talked about in the group I was in. I feel like that's kind of an empirical question. So, we can go find out if you measure the particular, can you build up commonalities across those particulars? And I think that you can. I think we've discovered you can. And maybe what happens is that some people over essentialize the mean of a group. And so they think that the mean is the only thing, and they don't pay as much attention to the standard deviation, the variation that's going on within the group. And so I think that getting lost, the standard deviation getting lost has been a problem. And I think I've been arguing against that for quite a while. But I would say that we do find commonalities. We just have to keep in mind that commonalities are not the only thing that's out there. And there's a different way of saying what you just said, I think, Jen.
Kate has had her hand up, but then I'd also like to make a brief comment if I may.
Go ahead, Kate.
Yeah, no, thanks, Nancy. I agree. I think we can empirically discover commonalities through particulars, and I think we've been doing that since the beginning of time, no doubt. But in reference to the mean, Jim Lamiel has some really interesting stuff in the context of personality measurement on the measurement of literally no one. And what he means is that when we aggregate across scores of individuals, and then perhaps we aggregate across persons within a group, and then we compare one group to another, we actually are making, oftentimes, psychologists are making often causal claims about literally no one, because it's about a population parameter. Which doesn't pertain to an individual person. And I agree with Jim on this point. And I think it's a general point to all quantitative psychological measurement that sort of assumes a trait dimension and, couples things into means and makes comparisons among means. However, I also agree with William that we absolutely can use particularities to generate or generalize into commonalities. And that's probably where many of our measurement items, the content, comes from, that we already have many of these commonalities in mind. And now we want to assess whether in a given group that come from a population seem to demonstrate that same kind of pattern.
Go ahead, Nancy.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment that as long ago as Aristotle, my guy Aristotle, had this notion of induction on particulars in the prior analytics. So, you folks who are talking about getting commonalities from particulars have a good Aristotelian heritage going on for you.
All right, the floating head from Carolina. Will, go ahead.
I am not a floating head. I'm a lawyer. So I just want to first say that Lamiel was of course very early influenced back to the 80s on my thinking and work. He's a great thinker. And then the second thing is that just in relation to what you're just saying, I have a paper in press at the Journal of Abnormal Psychology where we make the point that the structure of borderline personality disorder, the definition of personality disorder, actually applies to no individual because of that same point you're just making there. So I agree with that.
I don't know how to feel about that.
Well, I guess I would just very quickly add on, because I feel like I often need to say this when I say the same thing to my colleagues, but all is not lost. I mean, much of what we know is already there in these assessment tools and measurement tools that we create. So I don't think we have to throw it out because there is meaning. Obviously, there's meaning there. Again, I think, my tact is always, we need to be humble and we need to be transparent. Elise mentioned mixed methods, that it just seemed like a fairly obvious thing that we need mixed methods. We need to be coming at understandings from a variety of perspectives, and those methods can be very broad. And they certainly can include these quantitative measurement and assessment devices. They just need to have a kind of appropriately, grounded place within the whole. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the points that we were talking about in our breakout room, that we need a much richer, to bring in a lot of the qualitative, to just bring in a wide range of different ways of getting at things, because I think that provides a much more complicated, but also more satisfying picture.
And I think just adding on to that, in our chapter on character, we discuss a little bit about using more person-centered analyses, using things like latent profile analysis that look at patterns across multiple virtues that are typified by certain groups of individuals. So, I mean, even if you're looking at a given pattern of scores, that doesn't necessarily represent any one individual. That's also a characterization, if you will, but it's a closer characterization to a given individual than a mean would on a single variable approach.
Yeah, it's more like a prototype. Like some of Rosh's work would actually be useful, is creating these prototypes, and they don't actually refer to any one either, but they refer to sort of classes of individuals that we might sort persons into.
Right.
For
It's
one
interesting.
reason or another.
That also comes up when you're thinking about, like, we're talking about measuring people along these different variables, but it also comes up when we're thinking about, like, for example, the stimuli that we would want to generate for things like, let's say we're interested in measuring honesty. It's like, what are all the different stimuli that we would generate that people would respond to as being honest, appropriate, right? There we talk about it in the book as paradigm. It's a complicated and difficult word to say. Paradigmaticity.
Paradigmaticity.
Thank you very much. That's it, right? But that's the general idea, right? Is that you're trying to come up with what is paradigmatically across a wide range of people, what would count as paradigmatically honest, appropriate, or compassionate appropriate, or compassion relevant or honesty relevant stimuli. And that introduces some really interesting difficulties, not the least of which is, as people become increasingly virtuous, we would expect them to be sensitive to different stimuli that other people are not typically sensitive to. So beyond the paradigmatic, they might identify things that other people would not identify. And now what do we do with that? Do we think of that as being like, is that how do we understand when people are how do we understand the outliers? I guess would be one way of saying it. How do we understand outliers in terms of responses, outliers in terms of stimuli? We have to be really careful in how we think about that, because we would actually expect that as people become more robustly virtuous, that they're going to respond in a wider range of circumstances and in a wider range of capacities than your normal person.
This is reminding me a little bit of what Vincent Ang talked about last week, and so I think there's some promise in that particular direction, but it's a very complicated problem that we're struggling with here, a set of problems. Let's go with Dan and then Nancy.
A question about the project. When you talk about measurement, are you primarily, sorry, I don't have the book yet. Are you primarily imagining measuring the things people do, the responses to the trade relevant situations, or are you primarily or also thinking of measuring in some direct way the social cognitive mechanisms? And in some sense, if I may, and which one first, which is not a trivial, it's hard to, I can't quite tell what the measurement project is.
I mean, I'd say ultimately it's all of it. In other words, that the thought is that if what we're interested in is developing a robust program on virtue, you're gonna have to tackle all of it.
Then which one first? Of course, I'm asking because since a person, as you, one of the great things from your talk, as you gave the example where the person could be honest or compassionate. So of course you can't record their behavior as anything without knowing what they're doing. So that seems to imply that you have to do something else first because it's inherently indeterminate to classify the behaviors and plot them.
Right, so you probably, I mean, I think you'd have to start with what what it is that you're going to measure their responses to, right? So you are going to have, like if we want to see the degree to which people provide honest responses, and you've introduced an additional complication here, which is that virtues don't operate in isolation of one another, right? So that's complicated. That adds additional work that we'd have to at least keep in mind. But it's like, if you want to be able to bring people in or have a naturalistic setting where you're looking at the degree to which they manifest a particular virtue, you're going to have identified either the stimuli that they're being exposed to that you would expect is going to bring about that kind of response. So then you're looking at the degree to which they're giving that response, or you're going to have some way of identifying, if you're doing it in a more naturalistic setting, whether, like, it's not just about measuring how often they're honest, it's about measuring how often honesty would have been called for. So both sides are there in the project. If you don't have the first one, it's going to be hard to have the second one.
But I think if I can follow up to that, not being a psychologist, in order to really get at any virtue, I mean, there's got to be the stimulus, there's got to be the behavior in a naturalistic setting, and then there's got to be some sort of reflection, either at the time or later, preferably at the time if possible, about why the individual responded as he or she did. So I would say it's kind of almost a chicken and an egg problem, right? Because you got to have a response, but then you also need to have the account of why somebody did what they did. That wasn't what I was going to say. I was actually going to raise a different question when I raised my hand and change the subject a bit. Is that okay, Blaine?
Sure, you have the floor.
Thank you. I have a question for this group, this Michael Warren group, right? Were you the ones who made the suggestion that virtue is not a trait?
It was a question whether using empirical measurement tools, it admits that we're necessarily conceptualizing virtue as a trait. And I kind of pointed out to our group that there's a lot of moral psychologists that would contend that virtues are not traits because there's so much cross-situational variability.
Right.
But that's a little bit more background on what we talked about. But yeah, what are your thoughts, Nancy?
Well, I was immediately reminded of Thomas Herke's book, Virtue, Vice, and Value, which came out in 2001, which Jen cited on the topic of moral self-indulgence. He has an outlier view. Now he's a utilitarian. Okay, so there's hopeless right there. But I'm sorry. Oh goodness, this is being recorded. Okay, so he has a view that virtue is not a trait, but it's just sort of an action, right? So there are a couple of folks. I think Herke is one of them. Jorge Garcia is another one who has this view that action really is what a virtue is. Now they're outliers. So, that's where I thought you were going in your group. And I wanted to clarify that and say, I think that approach, if that's what you're talking about, is just it's completely mistaken in my view. And as far as I know, they're the only two philosophers who have endorsed that view.
Will, you had a thought?
Wait, did you say my name?
Yeah.
I didn't hear yet. I was going back to Dan's question. Should I hold off and come back later to that? Because Nancy's just brought up a really big issue.
No, don't let me. I just wanted to put my 2 cents in, and both you and Kate have your hands up. So please do carry on.
Well, yeah, because what you're bringing up is interesting. So I don't want to derail that. So
Go back to the other train.
okay, maybe we can keep both trains going. So I did, by the way, want to say how much I enjoyed this talk, Jen. It was fantastic. It was riveting. I really was absorbed by it. I really enjoyed it a lot. So thank you very much for that. And then I'm going to just, Dan, I wanted to sort of mention what some of you were bringing up, which is I'm sure, knowing you, that you've read DeHooer's work, but I just to bring it up again, I think it makes this really nice distinction between the functional and the cognitive approach and the integration of the two, and that the way to conceive of this is you're never really gonna be able to measure the social cognitive mechanisms directly. We can't measure them directly. We can only measure them sort of indirectly and make inferences about them by looking at the associations between different inputs and different activities and then outputs that happen, and then that creates this tension about what can we ultimately conclude about those social cognitive mechanisms, and how firmly should we make those conclusions, and so forth. So it's just a very brief summary of some really deep and interesting work.
I'll merely say that time does not allow for a complete response.
Well, there's probably a piece of truth. Kate, you had your hand up too.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond quickly, although there is no quick response really to Nancy's, I think, really important and relevant and true point. Although I will say, having worked with psychologists and having done a lot of critical work on personality, in particular personality measurement, of the kind of standard cognitive trait models, there are traits and there are traits. So people come to think of traits in psychology as theta, and theta is a dimension, and it's a part of a statistical model. And then there's the ordinary sense of trait or character or characteristic that many of us use, and there's a lot of gray in between. So I think sometimes the confusion or the sense that maybe people are not talking to each other when they really are, is that we might either be using different senses of that concept trait, or the same sense and not aware of it. So it's a tricky, I would say trait, like construct, they're tricky concepts, and there's a very slippery slope between ordinary and technical uses that we have to kind of keep in the forefront when we discuss them.
I think Jay might have had his hand up earlier.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of make a comment and ask also a question on that same point for what you brought up, Nancy. So thinking of maybe of trait as like a pattern of behaviors within a person. I mean, we kind of have to assume that to some degree that character has to be a trait in some way, and kind of then the degree in which virtue is a trait, or character is a trait, is something kind of where a lot of work has to be done. And so where we do a lot of work is in gratitude. And so, is gratitude a trait, right? And so is it a trait in general, or is gratitude a trait in the sense of, well, there's gratitude to female acquaintances and gratitude toward male acquaintances, and then gratitude toward male friends, and then female friends, and then spouse, and then toward all these different things, and then toward God, and then toward your company that you work for. Like, are those all separate traits, or is it just one, or are there separate sub traits? So trying to map out the degree or way in which this is just one trait, or is it separate traits? That's kind of difficulty and a little bit of what we're kind of trying to do right now with the grant that we're working on, just with gratitude. And it's really difficult and messy. And so that I was going to ask Nancy if the people you mentioned, are they, when they talk about their view, are they saying that no trait whatsoever exists, and they're just kind of discounting any consistent pattern of behavior at all, and talking purely action, and that people don't act consistently in any way?
I don't think they get that far because they're philosophers, right?
Okay.
No, and I don't mean this in I guess they're not psychologists, so they don't think in the same terms, right? So they're just making philosophical arguments about what virtues are. So they don't even get into trait terminology. And when I first started looking at psychology back, I don't know when it was, maybe 2010, 28 or something like that, I took a fair bit of time to read Mitchell and Shoda's work. And I looked at some of the literature on traits, and I found the theories to be absolutely baffling, right, and daunting. And so I thought Michel and Shoda were the ones who had the best conceptualization. So I went with CAPS. And then later, Jen Cole-Wright and Dan McAdams twisted my arm and said, oh, whole trait theory is the way to go. And so I buckled to that pressure and, and eventually, admitted that, yeah, Will and Aranda has the better theory for integrating with philosophers who think that virtue is a kind of trait. And I'm not using trait. I mean, let me say virtue is a kind of X, right? Because I don't, I don't want to be associated with like the big five, right? That's not what I'm talking about here, and how they're conceptualized. But just to not be so long-winded, the folks that I was referring to, they don't get into that question at all, right? My own view is that there is a single trait called gratitude that can be applied in a variety of circumstances. So I know there are a couple of other folks, the situationist John Doris and his buddies, well, John Doris would be the main one, who argued for local traits, right? And I don't think that's correct. I know the CAPS theory were local traits, but they were local traits in a different sense. What else is there? That was another point I was going to make. Oh yeah, Bob Adams in philosophy has a theory whereby he thinks that there's that a larger trait is sort of a building up or an additive of traits that occur in specific situations. Now I don't know what that means. I don't know what it would mean to build up a trait from gratitude to your mother-in-law to gratitude to your father-in-law or something like that. I have no clue. I think that we develop a trait in specific circumstances as we're growing up, that it then becomes generalizable because situations have meaning for us, and that we end up having a trait of gratitude that we're then able to apply with the use of phronesis to various situations. So that's how I look at it. But I'm very interested to hear about your project.
Yeah, it does sound very cool. The other person that I think of, Nancy, as you're talking, is Christian Miller as a bit of a trait and a local trait advocate. And so we'll have a chance to talk with him next week, I think. When is he coming with you, Will? In fact, he's kind of leading the group in a way.
The other way around, yeah. I'm coming with him.
Yeah, you're coming with him. So I think that might be a very interesting conversation for us next week. It's also a nice segue into looking forward to seeing you again next week. These have been fantastic gatherings. I have to tell you that I'm humbled and thrilled by this august group and the conversations we're having. I just think it's so fantastic. It's so wonderful that we're together and that I get to hear from you and learn from you, and we learn from each other. We certainly have plenty of hard things to do, so it's good to have some people to rely on and support, and people to raise questions about what we're doing as well. So thank you so much, and thank you very much to the panel for your excellent work and providing us some really good things to talk about. Looking forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you. It was good to see you all.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for a great talk. See you next week.
Will.
Nancy?
Oh, she hopped
Hello.
off. Do you want me to communicate something to Nancy?
Yeah, I think she knows, but I just to be clear, I don't think
Oh, she's
whole
coming
trait
back.
theory.
Hold on a second.
Oh. You must have heard me say her name at the last second. Did you hear me say your name, Nancy?
I tried to run.
Yeah, I just want to make, well, thanks for the nice comments about your arm being twisted.
About what?
Yeah, the nice comments about whole trait theory. I do want to just emphasize that whole trait theory would not exist if it weren't for CAPS. I mean, it's hugely builds on and incorporates CAPS, and but particularly this issue of having the generalizability across situations and across things more than just local traits is particularly the big difference. But it wouldn't exist without CAPS. It's a yeah.
Yeah, I argued in my book, as you know, that, I went beyond the data. Michelle and Shoda, like you guys, you psychologists, are bound by the data. Philosophers are free of that. And so, I argued beyond that for generalizability. But then I think you guys have the best, you've done wonderful work. And so, the book wouldn't exist without your work. And this has been such an important inspiration for us for what we're doing.
Thanks. Yeah, well, it's like I said before, my brain cannot handle the fact that people of your stature have taken whole trait theory so seriously. It's just, it's inconceivable for me. I still haven't quite understood that.
Well, thank you, Will. If you could just repeat that stature comment to my staff at the office.
Yeah. I think we've got it in recording, so we'll just pass
That's
it on.
true. It is a recording.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm.
Well, what you have to understand, Will, is that the stature goes back to you as because people are taking it seriously, and that's, and it's a wonderful thing. But it is a little hard to grasp sometimes. I get that completely.
Well, you are the Piaget to our Kohlberg.
Oh, but thank you. It's a nice fantasy. All
I
right.
look forward to seeing you all next week.
It was really fun talk. Really.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thanks, guys. Thank you, Jen. Thank you. As I said earlier, I admire a psychologist for two main reasons. One is that you're deviously clever about measurement, and two is that you do such wonderful PowerPoints. So
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
bye. Thank you.